Thanks for taking the time to watch me make some stuff today. I appreciate it. As they said, my name is Greg. I'm the head baker for Public and Quality Bread here in Chicago. We feature local farms, whole grains, and focus on natural fermentation, both of which first and foremost for flavor, but it's also the healthiest way to make bread. We serve about just over 100 restaurants here in Chicago with a small bakery staff of me plus 6 bakers. So we've gotten pretty efficient, and we really enjoy it. And today I will be making some rye queen amande. Does anybody know what a queen amande is? Anybody? A little bit, maybe? So it's a super flaky like butter pastry from Brittany in France, and it's one of my favorite things. And so I'm going to do some rye flour, and it's like maple and rye. I think the flavoring pairs well together. But in true me fashion, because dough takes more than the 45 minutes that I have here, I'll be kind of bouncing around and showing you the different steps, and I'll hopefully do it in a way that you can follow along. Sound good? Cool. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I'd like to take it easy and be a super, kind of chill kind of guy. So don't be afraid to interrupt me and whatever. I'm kind of used to it. So when we are talking about lamination, especially laminating by hand, well, I suppose let's start at the beginning. Lamination is what you do when you're making croissants or puff pastry or queen amande. It's where you're putting butter or dough around butter and then making these layers. So essentially, that's why it's called lamination, is because you're enveloping the butter in dough. There is such a thing as reverse lamination, where you put dough around, or butter around dough, but we'll be doing the traditional one for us. So, first off, I'm going to start with some European style butter. It's 83%. We started getting some 84% butter fat or milk fat butter in the bakery a little while ago, and while it's delicious and that extra percentage of fat is kind of neat, it really kind of, because of the extra fat is in there, ends up being really breaks off into shards rather than coming together nicely when we make what's called a barrage, if you're being super French about it, which sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. So 2 pounds of butter is going to go in this whole thing. So I know I said that our way of making bread is healthy, but when we're talking about baking pastries, we make some sacrifices, okay? Thank you. Yeah.
Special kind of butter?
What's that?
Special kind of butter?
European style. So I think comparable in the store would be like Plugra or something like that. I'm going to break it, or rather cut it into pieces here. And I did put some flour down on top of my parchment paper. I'm using bread flour. It doesn't particularly matter what kind of flour that you use. You just want to have the butter not stick to the parchment. More flour will go on top. And I'm working with cold butter, okay? Now you get your big stick out and you hit it. Relieves a lot of tension. It's great. Say, no, I don't want to pay for a wall. Woo! Get to break some stuff, it's great, okay? But the point here is that you're keeping the butter cold, but you're making it pliable, okay? So it came from cold, now it's pliable, right? I'm gonna put some more flour on top, and I'm just gonna kind of pile it up. And hit it just a little bit more. Now I want it to start sticking together. So once again, pile it up. At a certain point, too much flour is not a good thing, so I'm going to start recycling the flour that I have. And then getting right down on top of it and starting to really smash it together like this. So you should notice that it's becoming smooth. And not breaking apart. If you see that it's breaking apart, we're just going to keep kind of working it. Or you could have hit it a little bit more, okay? So we ultimately want this thing to end up being kind of even. Well, not kind of, it ultimately vary, but so the way that we're going to start doing that, you can't really like control it when you first put it into the big pile, but now you can kind of start folding it. And I'm starting to take a brush and just brush off any excess flour, just because I want the butter to actually come together as its own thing, and I don't want any flour in between the butter pieces itself. Okay. If I notice that it's sticking, I'm just going to flip the entire thing over. And work it just a little bit more. So now you can see it's more of a nice rectangle. I'm going to even it out, just elongate it just a little bit more. You want this to stay pretty thick at this point. I'm shooting for maybe just over 1/4 of an inch. And again, as even as possible. Anytime that you're working with, especially pastry, but most food, the more even that you're able to do it, the better it's going to look in the end. So this is going to be my barrage, okay? That's what they call it in France. The butter that you put into the pastry. So at this point, I'm going to set this off to the side. Get some more flour down. And I'm going to get out my dough that I made yesterday. You do want to work with cold dough when you're laminating. You want cold dough, and you want, again, soft but cold but pliable butter. Okay. So this dough, I will go over how we made it in just a minute here. But it's kind of a lengthy process to laminate this whole thing, so I wanted to do this part of it first. So I got my dough that I made yesterday, and now I need to get it into a shape that will envelop the amount of butter that I have. Okay, so you can kind of see that it's almost like, you know, if you put these two things side by side, it's about equal parts butter and flour. So it's going to be good. Okay, so I'll kind of get it to a good width first. And this is the, you know, as I'm going to go around the butter, I want to make sure that this can actually envelop the whole thing. So this needs to be pretty long. Okay, I think we're almost there. And then we want to go a little bit longer this way because we want it to be just longer than the amount of butter that I have. So now this will completely encase the butter, which is a good thing. brush off any excess flour. At this point, any flour in between your layers is going to make your pastry like open up and kind of fall over, okay? You want your dough to be touching dough, and you want to not have any flour in between that. I'll kind of show you a trick about how I do that, besides having a nifty paintbrush. There is some more stuff that we can do. So I will now take my barrage, and technically speaking, the dough is called the détrempe. So I've got barrage, détrempe, or dough and butter. Take your pick. So I flipped it in there. I did see some flour go underneath, so I'm going to lift it up and brush that out. I'm going to brush off this back side of it. Okay. So first of my pro tips, first one is free, is that if you get dough wet, dough will stick to itself. So I've got a water bottle here, and I wet the parts that are going to where the dough is exposed. Okay. So if you get dough wet, it will stick to itself. If you are wet, dough will not stick to you. Okay? Who knew? So now I've got my moistened dough here. I've got my seam wet also. So now the dough is sticking to itself, and I'm going to kind of press on it to lock it in. Okay? So again, this is why it's called lamination. I've got butter, I'm putting dough around it, we're laminating, it's cool. I'm gonna move it off to the side and get a little bit more flour down.
It's very cool, isn't it?
Okay. Now, in order to not break my butter, I'm going to use a rocking motion and then apply pressure. So I'm getting up on top of like a larger piece of the butter and pressing down until it's smooth. Make sure it doesn't pop out the side there. Now, the closer that you can get the butter to the edge or the lip of your dough, the less waste you're going to have, which in the restaurant industry or really anywhere is a good thing. I'm lucky that you guys have such a long stage. So I'm going to go pretty thin here. And like I said, you want to be as even as you possibly can, because if you do this evenly, then your layers will be even, your pastry will look nice. Okay. So at this point, you should be able to feel it, and you should feel like solid butter beneath it. Okay. You shouldn't feel like islands of butter. You shouldn't feel a piece and then feel cracker dough and then more piece. You know. If you do that, you're kind of SOL. You can't really fix the butter once it's in there, okay? Now, I'm going to trim off the ends, okay? And I should see butter running all the way through. If I don't, I'm going to trim just a little bit more until I do see it all the way through, which now I do, right? I'm going to try to pull this a little bit closer. And then do the same thing on the other side. You don't want to fold dough in and have it be, you know, like a big piece of dough here without butter in between it. You want even layers of dough and then butter and then dough and then butter. If you have dough stuck on dough, no matter how much or how long you bake your product, it's not going to appear baked. It's going to appear doughy, okay? So this is one way that we kind of get around that, is we trim off the excess dough on the sides. Now, don't throw this away. If you're doing this in real life, I'm going to throw this away because I don't have the time to make two things today. But don't throw these scraps away. You can toss it with cinnamon sugar and a little bit of butter. Let it proof in like a container And then you got monkey bread, which is great. Okay, I brushed off my excess flour, and I am now going to spray with a little bit of water. Need a little bit more space so I can get this in front of me. The water will, remember when I said if you have flour in between your layers, your pastry will rise and then fall over. Spraying it with water will obviously take that up, and it's also going to, as I fold it, because I want to book fold this thing, not let the layers shift at all, okay? So I'm going to do this into a book fold. So right now I've got 2 layers on each side. I'm going to brush off the excess again. Spray it. And I do want a little bit of a gap here because I'm going to fold this over again. And now I've got 4 layers. Cool. So now at this point it is exponential. Get more flour down. You always want to roll with your layers. Okay, these layers are exposed. I want to roll it this way. Okay, I don't want to roll it this way, otherwise I'm just going to break this seam. So I'm going to do the same thing, rolling it until that same thickness. Okay, you always want to do it evenly. Same thickness. A little bit longer. Professional bakeries have what's called a sheeter. It's essentially 2 rolling pins with a conveyor belt on it. But we're not fancy, so we get out a rolling pin. Okay, so now I've got my even piece again. I'm going to check the underside because there's always this kind of crease. And again, I want to expose all of the butter, so I want to cut in front of that crease on the dough side. Okay, so now you can see I've got 4 layers. Okay, nice and even. Bring this in front of me again. As you can see, you do get a fair amount of trim. So like I said, you want to find something to do with that, and monkey bread is a great way to use that up. Okay, brush it off. Give it a spray. Book fold it. Now I've got 8 layers here. I've got 8 layers here. Now I've got 16 layers total. So now I have to let this rest. Why? Because the dough is made of wheat flour and rye flour, and wheat flour has gluten, right? It's not all that scary, I promise. And the more that you work gluten, the stronger that it gets, and if you work it too much, it'll start to tear. So I can only feasibly roll this, for me, 2 times in one turn, is what it's called, before it'll start to tear in a way that's going to destroy the product. So if you do start to see tearing, that just means that you need to stop. You need to refrigerate your dough for a little bit. You also don't want to warm up your butter too much, because then it'll start leaking out, and that's not what you want. You want it to remain that like cold, pliable. It's called plasticizing your butter. Okay. So put it back in the box and let it rest in the cooler. Okay. So how did we get there? I knew you were going to ask. What we're going to do, got some warm water, bread flour, rye flour, some soft butter, and then salt, dry yeast, and fenugreek. Is anybody familiar with fenugreek? Maybe a little bit. It's fake maple, right? When you see maple syrup, that's not actually just maple syrup. It's usually corn syrup with fenugreek or steeped with fenugreek. But in our sense, it does help the flavor of the maple come through more. Okay. Just maple syrup in the dough would not really be pronounced enough. It just kind of gets lost with like the butter and the flakiness of the product. So we're adding a little bit of spice to embellish. Thank you. All right. So now we just mix it on low. If you notice, I did not put the yeast in the water with a little bit of sugar. That's kind of a common myth. You don't really need to do that. And I also did have it sitting with my salt. Again, the common misconception is that salt kills yeast. It doesn't. It just kind of makes it a little bit harder to do what it needs to do. And if it's already, if the yeast is already dry anyway, it don't really matter. It's not going to get much drier. So I just put that in with the dries. But some folks do like to just make sure that their yeast is alive and active, and what they do is add a little bit of water to the yeast with a little bit of sugar and wait till it bubbles. Again, I don't need to do that. In fact, most of my products are naturally leavened anyway, so it's a completely different kind of beast. So I'm just going to mix this on slow until it is really smooth and shiny and strong. Good, I've got about 20 minutes left. My oven here. So I wanted to be able to show you guys what these actually look like. And again, remember when we're talking about bread and yeast leavened products, it does take more time than 45 minutes. So, do it on a Sunday morning sometime you got some time. Yes, sir. Oh, it's very dry. I would say about 60%. Yeah, so gentleman asked what hydration, and I responded with a percentage. When we're talking about bakery things, we measure the amount of liquid and moisture in the dough by a percentage. Everything is based off of the weight of the flour. So that means for every 1,000 grams of flour in the dough, there's 600 grams of water. Actually, it might be a little bit less than that. It might be about 55%. So for this is pretty dry. So these I made this morning, have been proofing. Looks like I can only fit one in at a time or two. And baking it at 350 for about 20 minutes. And there's a timer there, so it don't really matter. Looks like I'm doing this machine a disservice by doing this heavy, or this dry of a dough in here, so I'm going to not break it. You're welcome. And I'm going to knead it by hand. You can, the dough hook like this, you can see it's just like kind of that curved one, is a little bit harder for me to work with dough like this. I prefer like the spiral ones because it keeps it down in the bowl, rather than this one, it's like it just kind of smashes against the side. So I'm just going to knead this for a little while until it's smooth and shiny and strong. And the way that I'm going to knead is, if you see, I'm using the heel of my hand, rolling against the table, and then folding it and rolling it again. So really get kind of rock your body behind it, get your weight into it. It's kind of therapeutic, more or less, unless you have to do it for a long time. Then it's not, then it's annoying. Okay. So if you can see, when it's first started, it's just very pockmarked, it's very shaggy, and the more that I work it, the more gluten it develops. So, just to throw this out there, gluten, I'm sure everyone is aware of that term these days, but does anybody know what gluten actually is? Blake, do you know? No? So gluten is what gets formed between the two of the proteins in wheat flour, also rye flour and barley, and forms an elastic chain. Okay, so it's really just two proteins that form an elastic bond, and which doesn't in itself sound all that scary, right? So why are we avoiding it? Well, the reason is that there is the way that commercial wheat is grown is very chemical dependent. Okay, it's grown with herbicides and fungicides and pesticides, and then for ease of harvest, farmers will spray glyphosate or Roundup all over it to dry it out, and then they'll run their combine on it. So you've got all of these chemicals, right? And then the mill will then add more chemicals by way of dough conditioners and emulsifiers and things like that, one of which is calcium sulfate. And what that does is allow dough to slide down big factory bakery machines really, really easily. But it's also what people use to make tile grout, okay? Yeah. So when people say I eat gluten and I eat bread and I feel bad, I believe you, but is it the gluten or is it the tile grout? Which is actually making you feel bad? Right. So with our bread and our products, everything is grown organically or transitional organically. We do want to support those farmers through the transitional process before they make it to being able to be certified organic. And then we ferment our dough for much longer than a factory bakery will, which really breaks down a lot of the complex sugars. So when people say that they have a gluten intolerance, usually they don't have an issue trying our bread. Celiacs are definitely a different thing, but the people that are just gluten intolerant usually have no issues trying our product. Okay, so if you see, the more that I work this, the tighter that it's getting, and the smoother it's going to get. For the sake of time, I'm not going to take this all the way to being very smooth, but the longer that you do this, it will become smooth, it will become shiny, and that's what you're looking for, okay? So I'm gonna put this back in the bowl, and I'm gonna let this rise at room temperature for about 2 hours, and then I'm going to punch it down or fold it, and it would be a very similar process. So pretend that this is about double in size. I just take it out of the bowl, knock out the gas out of it, and roll it up like this again, put it back in the bowl, cover it, and then refrigerate it overnight. That's the dough that you saw me working with today. Okay? Any questions? Cool. All right. So, we can try to give our next turn. Why not? So now my dough is relaxed a little bit. Let's try it. What I'm looking for is how firm my dough is. Okay, so if you see I'm able to press on it, my fingerprint is staying there, which is generally a good thing. That means the gluten has relaxed a little bit. If I'm pressing on it and it springs right back, my gluten has not been relaxed enough. Okay. So again, I'm rolling with my layers. My exposed layers are this way, and I'm just going to get down on top of it one more time. And a little bit of butter or flour will help me here. So trying to go back to that same original thickness that I had. Okay, now I can see a little bit of tearing here, so that means I did not let this rest quite long enough, but I'm not going to cry about it. I'll be okay, don't worry. Okay, so same thickness all the way through. Brush it one more time. Cut it. So now if you recall, I've got 16 layers per side now. And on this last fold, what I'm gonna do is still spray it. Now I've got maple sugar, okay? So this is an actual thing. And it is maple syrup that has been boiled long enough for it to not have any water left. Okay, so it's just it looks like regular sugar. And I'm just gonna really load it up here. Again, when we said that this is the healthiest way to make things, I was lying, sorry.
Did you take the calories out for Chicago?
What's that?
Did you take the calories out for Chicago?
Yeah. And then I'm gonna fold it one more time. Fold. Brush off my flour. Give it one last spray here. Dust it with more sugar. And actually I forgot a little bit of salt too, because that's delicious. Fold it again. Now, I want to let this rest one more time before I go and shape them. So back in the box, back into the fridge. So, maybe I'll turn my pastries here. That'll be fine. In case this wasn't going to be indulgent enough, I thought that maybe we could make some maple pastry cream to put on top of it. Okay? The way that we're going to do that is I've got milk. I'm going to put that in a pan with some maple syrup. And some salt. And I'm going to get it onto maybe like medium heat. I'm going to put some eggs in the larger bowl with cornstarch. I'm going to whisk that around until all of the cornstarch is absorbed. Something like that. And now I'm going to start whisking my milk while it heats up, because you don't want this to scorch, okay? So you do need to tend to this pretty diligently. While I'm standing here whisking, does anybody have any questions?
What was your question?
My question is, could you use brown sugar instead of the maple sugar that you had? Like some of us can't find the maple sugar.
Sure. So I think that you can probably find maple sugar online, but I would use just regular granulated sugar instead. If you want the same kind of flavor profile, you can, where there's maple in the pastry itself, or the fenugreek, and you can get that same profile by dusting just a little bit, or adding a little bit of fenugreek to the sugar as well. But then it's not particularly maple quinamon, it's just fenugreek quinamon, which is fine. It's okay. But yeah, you can just use regular granulated, and that's okay. Anybody else? No? Jeez. Okay.
You all just want to taste it, right? It's going to be delicious.
Just waiting to taste it? So yeah. Luckily at the bakery, I do eat all of the products that we make, But luckily we make about 10,000 to 15,000 pounds of dough in a week. And everything is hand shaped, and our mixers are rather large, I would say, but they don't tilt or anything, so there's no way to get that dough out except that you gotta go in and get it. So we call it bakery CrossFit, okay? Yeah. Kind of funny, I actually started going to the gym significantly more after I started being a baker, just because it made my job easier. And yeah, so it was just kind of interesting like that. So you can see my milk is about ready to boil, which is a good thing, I think, right? Yep, that's hot. Okay, now we need to temper these eggs. And when you're tempering eggs, the point is that you want to add small amounts of hot liquid kind of shortly at a time to start bringing the temperature of the egg up without coagulating it, without scrambling it, okay? And the way that you do that, so I'm just gonna whisk my eggs here. You can see that my milk is boiling, and I'm just going to whisk in a slow, steady stream. Okay. And this is going to raise the temperature of those eggs without letting them actually cook. Once you get the first little bit in, you can go like a little bit quicker. Until you're all in there. And then you put it back in the pot. Until it starts to thicken. And then in the interest of time, I'm going to speed this up a little bit. How are we doing back here? Not quite? Not quite. Okay. So now you do have to keep whisking, again, to prevent scorching. You don't want it to taste burned. Although in fancy restaurants you can kind of get away with burning stuff if you just put that it's burnt on the menu. That's kind of cool, right? Looking at you, burnt orange, burnt cinnamon. I mean, those are good, but it's kind of cool that we could do that these days. Just burn something to be honest about it. So you can see that it's thickening here. Good thing. So, very thick now. And my bubbles are going away. And now you want to be very diligent about stirring it quickly and all over. You notice I'm not just stirring in the center, I'm going around the sides until you start seeing it really bubble. And you're waiting for it to do really kind of like 3 good bursts of air beneath it. 1, 2, and 3. So, good. Now, we're going to add some more butter. Whisk that in. You do want to use cold butter because cold butter will, just like when you're making a pan sauce, will emulsify into the cream. You don't want it to break and separate. Okay, so now my pastry cream is done, and we want to strain it to make sure that there's no lumps or there's no, accidentally coagulated egg in there. So passing it through a chinois will make it really nice and smooth. That's how we improve texture of things like this and soups and sauces and things like that. Okay, so just pushing it on through there with a spoon or a ladle. And you can see that it's really nice and smooth. Not sure if you can smell it, but it's scented with maple, which is really nice. And There we go. Now, when you make this, you do want to put plastic wrap directly on the cream, and then you refrigerate it, preferably overnight, okay? So when you make your dough, you can make your cream. Now, let's finish our pastries here. We're now done with the box. A little bit more flour on top. And I'm going to roll it a little bit against the layers. I know I said never do that, but you'll find that I often stretch the truth like that. It's okay. Do as I say, not as I do. Now, this one we're going to keep it a little bit thicker once we roll it like this, okay? A little bit thicker than our original layers. Okay? Good. So, brush it off one last time. Brush underneath it, because now I'm going to be forming these, and you don't want a pocket of flour underneath your pastry. Okay, I'm going to take off the sides, and if you can see, you've got 4 distinct layers with that sugar layer in between it. It's going to be delicious, promise. Going to take off the sides, the top and the bottom, so your layers will be exposed. Okay. Now I just measure this kind of by hand. Again, not kind of, very literally. And then, just to make them even, I'll take off the top part too. So again, save all of this stuff and make monkey bread, because that's a good snack. We love snacks. And then, same thing, just using my hand as a guide. So hopefully have these things come out pretty even. I'm going to do one last spray. More sugar. Some more salt. Okay. Now, I need some pans. Luckily we have some right here. I'm gonna wear a glove for this one. And I'm gonna take some soft butter. How many pieces have I got? 10? And just put some more butter in the molds here so they'll release nicely. Okay. And then one last little round of sugar to make sure that it's got a really nicely caramelized bottom. Most places when you see these being served, they serve them upside down, so you've got that crispy shell. Now there's a couple ways that I like to shape these. Either you can pick up each side like this and then like this, and then just shove it down in the mold there. Or you can do the corners in. Both are acceptable. I'm sure the French have a very particular reason for doing it this way, as they often do. But that's it. That's how we shape our molds. Now, these will proof at about 80 degrees or just higher than room temp, unless you're my fiance, which she loves it boiling in the apartment all the time, for about 2 hours. Okay, so through the magic of TV, I made these. Ta-da. Oh, yeah, sure, why not? So these would be this style. These ones would be this style. And again, through the magic of TV, I magically have this pastry cream. Suppose it could have came to room temp a little bit more, but just to be a little bit more indulgent about it. Okay, so that is our pastry. Ta-da!
Serve for chef. Hey, doesn't that look delish?
Do we have another plate?
What was that?
Do we have another plate? I think.
And if you have a question?
We are giving. We can have them. Okay.
Greg.
I think these look better.
Greg,
for the
we have
picture.
a
I don't
quick
think we should put
question.
that out. Thank you. What's that? Yes.
If you froze that like maple cream, would it be like custard?
You cannot freeze this. It has cornstarch, and things thickened with cornstarch will not stay thick once you freeze them. The water ends up becoming really sharp when it's frozen, and then that'll break the bonds of the cornstarch. So you can actually not freeze the pastry cream. Good question.
Smart question.